Good afternoon and welcome back to another episode of Talk of the Towns. We have a great episode today. Everybody's been calling, everybody's been asking, what's the big beautiful bill? What's in it? How does it affect towns? And today we have a special guest with us all the way from Washington, D.C., who we work very closely with at NATaT, and she's with NATaT. We're NATaT, she's NATaT. Uh, National Association of Towns and Townships, which Jennifer can get into. But Jennifer Imo is the executive director of NATaT, and we've been working very closely with her here at NATaT. We've been down to Washington a few times. This last time we'll talk about with Jennifer how we worked really hard on this big, beautiful bill to protect local governments. But first, let's always talk about where you can find this podcast. It is on YouTube, it is on Spotify, it is on the Apple platform. You can get this podcast on any of those platforms. We always ask that you do three things: like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe really helps us. Spread the word. We talk all things town here, all things towns. My name is Chris Ketzley. I'm the executive director. We've been doing this podcast for the past couple of months. The viewership is growing, so let's keep that going. And hopefully you're all getting something out of this. If you have any comments, if you have any suggestions, please email us, info@nytowns.org, info@nytowns.org. Please email, send us your comments. But today, it's all about the big, beautiful bill with Jennifer. Jennifer, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Chris. I am very happy to be here and excited to talk more about NATaT and also some of the good work we did as an organization, including NIOT, and getting what we needed out of the big, beautiful bill.
Great. And just as a editorial note, Jennifer and I were chatting about how warm it is. I am outside today because I've been traveling, and I'm in a different area than normally my air-conditioned office. It's very warm today for a jacket, but that's okay. We'll get through it. But I got to imagine, Jennifer, you're down in Washington. What's the temperature down there?
Right now it's 94, but I think it feels like 100. The humidity is just insane. And as I mentioned to you, I tried to have my lunch outside and realized that was not a good idea. So it is in the AC for me right now.
Yeah, Sarah and I were down there. What was it? Maybe April?
In May.
In May. And of course, the contrast between upstate New York and Washington in May is pretty stark. It was like 50 up here, and I think it was 85 down there back in May.
Beautiful. It was beautiful. You guys picked a great time to come. So
yeah, really was. Before we get going on the big beautiful bill, Jennifer, maybe talk a little bit about NATaT as an organization, how many members. I can tell you before you even get into it how valuable it is to NIOT. Not just all the services we provide legislatively on the federal level, which is critically important, but really the networking and the sharing of how we run our organizations with all my sister organizations in all the many states that are members. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So NATaT was formed in the 1970s. There were a group of executive directors from various town and township organizations, primarily in the sort of Midwest and up in the New York Northeast area. And there are organizations like the National League of Cities that do, a great job representing the voice of cities and our larger local governments, as well as like the National Association of Counties, which represents the interests of our county governments. But there wasn't really a voice for the individual towns and townships, which as many you serve different government roles in every state. I am originally from North Carolina, and there are towns in the state of North Carolina, but those towns are part of the North Carolina League of Municipalities because they provide the same government services. Towns and cities provide the same government services, but that's obvious. That's not the case in New York and our NATaT member states. So NATaT was formed, like I said, in the 70s. We they had an individual office in DC with a full staff, and about 20 years ago, the NATaT board hired my company, the Ferguson Group, to represent the national organization and not have just their a standalone office and staff. So I have had the honor and privilege of serving as the federal director of the National Association of Towns and Townships for 20 years now. There are 9 state, town, and township organizations that are a part of NATaT, and that from our last count, it means we represent approximately 13,000 individual towns and townships collectively, which that is a very loud voice. When we go on the Hill and we talk about the representation and the number of towns and townships and communities that we do represent, that number is a resounding number, and folks listen. It is great because we've got so our NATaT board is made up of the executive directors of those individual state, town, and township organizations. And just quickly, they include, of course, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, South Dakota, North Dakota, and did I say Minnesota? I don't know. I'm missing one.
I think you got Minnesota there. Yeah.
All right. So anyway, they're 9. And so, what's really great about that too is, you have representatives in Capitol Hill that are part of leadership. They are, chair people and ranking members of committees of jurisdiction over many of the issues that are of importance to NATaT. So we are a very loud and effective voice for towns and townships here in Washington, D.C. We have a small but mighty staff, and the work that our individual states do, like you mentioned, you and Sarah were down in May. I mean, the work that each state does, and sort of giving our collective message, has been extraordinarily advantageous to our towns and townships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should note that for New Yorkers listening to this, they hear the word township, right? You just keep saying town and townships because some
Right.
states refer to their towns, like New York would call it a town, but Ohio and some others call it townships. So we have to make sure we include all, right?
That's exactly right. And that took me a while to figure out, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely varied, but just like you all provide different services, you're called different things. So
Yeah.
towns in New York, but like you say, and towns in Wisconsin, the townships pretty much in all of our other member states.
Now, not every state has a town type government, correct?
Correct. That's
Yeah.
right. That's
Which is
exactly
interesting to me, right? As you go more west, I understand
That's right.
that doesn't really exist.
So you can see we're sort of in that northeast,
Yeah.
Midwest area, but yeah, it's and that's really kind of the concentration. I think it's the older forms of government, and as yeah.
And villages are even more unique to Northeast, right?
That's
Yeah. Yeah, because I'll tell you a quick story, and I know we're going to touch on the ARPA funds that they allocated years ago.
Mhm.
When they passed that bill, they forgot about villages altogether. And I am in town. I was a supervisor of a town that has a village inside it. So it is a separate government, but it's inside the town. And they
right.
forgot about the village. So the state of New York took that portion of every town that had a village and gave it to the village as opposed to the town. It was awful. But they didn't include villages in that big ARPA bill. So that was unfortunate, but
Mm-hmm.
We'll move on from ARPA right now. We might come back to it a little bit later,
Sure.
but let's move on to really, so I get a lot of questions about the big, beautiful bill. It is huge. There's a lot in there that I have no idea, but we just focus on really how it impacts towns and what we came down and really advocated for the legislative agenda for NATaT and all the organizations involved. Let's start with one that we really thought was important, not because it was so essential to local government, but I think the service they provide within communities was so important to local government. And that was maintaining the tax exempt status for 501c3s, all the 501c nonprofit organizations. We understood that there was some thought of eliminating that tax exempt status. There's some reasoning for that. But we really felt, and we really worked hard for folks to see down there in Congress, that it's critically important to communities to maintain that and to make sure we have really viable organizations within our communities to help local governments deliver those services. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jennifer?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to back up a little bit about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, for those who may not really know what was the impetus of this. So when President Trump was in his first term in 2017, he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that included a large swath of tax benefits for various entities, right? And those were expiring. And so what was needed was to put together a package that we call a reconciliation package that could get through because you had Republican control of the House, Senate, as well as in the White House. So you can go through a process called reconciliation where you don't need kind of that super majority of votes to get something done. It's very hard to get anything signed into law here in DC at the federal level. So when a party has the trifecta, they use this process, and it's a budgeting process called reconciliation. So in order to get those tax cuts extended, they also had to find ways to pay for the extension of those tax cuts. And so we were at NATaT as an organization, we're kind of playing this in multiple ways because one, we had to make sure that they were not identifying ways to pay for the bill that would negatively impact us. So that's one. And then two, for like the actual tax policy, we wanted to make sure that some of our largest priorities, which we'll get into, like the SALT deduction, as well as a program called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, we wanted to make sure those were included. But, we were wanting to also make sure that certain what they call pay-fors were not included, which would include taking away that tax exempt status of all 501c organizations, because again, that would put more money into the federal coffers and therefore help pay for these tax extensions. And then the other was preserving the tax exempt status of municipal bonds. So when we actually had a sort of a preview of our legislative fly-in and had a board meeting in February, and went and spoke with and that you and Sarah attended. That we went and spoke with excuse me, committee staff, primarily, that were writing the bill, right? And so what we said to them was, look, we understand that you have very difficult decisions to make on how to pay for this massive bill, and but we want to just say, here's why we don't need or cannot have the tax exempt status of our 501c organizations go away. Because ultimately what would happen is for organizations like NATaT, for NIAT, for all of our state, town, or township organizations, if they became taxable entities, there's many that wouldn't survive,
Right.
right? And so then our public service is doing what we can to ensure stronger communities in our states, right? And financially, we would not, many of our state organizations and therefore our national organization would not have survived. One of the things too is that you have to make sure that members of Congress really understand the good work that
Yes.
these organizations are doing and what the impact could be if those organizations went away. So
Right.
really did want to highlight kind of the importance of these, especially the 501c organizations that represent the interests of local governments and what harm could potentially happen if that tax exempt status was taken away.
I know that Congress kind of, highlighted or focused on the bad actors, right? There's bad actors everywhere. There's these 501c3s. There's been a proliferation of those, and maybe they're not all doing what they're supposed to be doing, but there are so many good ones
That's
in
right.
communities that we can't just throw everything out with the bad ones. Police it better. Maybe put some more stuff on it that makes sure that it really truly is a tax exempt for good, for profit or non for profit organization. But that was a big win. But you mentioned something even more important to local governments
Hmm.
is the twin issue, the tax exempt status of muni bonds. When we came down there and we sat through some presentations, some really great speakers, by the way, very educational. I learned something I wasn't aware of, that I think the number was somewhere around, and you could probably correct me, maybe 75, 80% of infrastructure is paid for by state and local government, not federal government or built by. So using these tax exempt bonds are critically important for local governments. It would have decimated the muni bond
Mhm.
market and would have made it so much harder for local governments to do projects. Can you talk a little bit about
That's
that?
Yeah, absolutely. And not only would it make it more difficult because these of course local governments go put out bonds to pay for large infrastructure projects,
Right.
right? And if those bonds aren't tax exempt, they're not as competitive in the market. And what would happen is projects would be extraordinarily more expensive, and they would either not get done or that cost would be passed down to your members,
Right.
right? So for over 100 years they've used municipal bonds to build infrastructure around the country, and we're talking everything from hospitals to roads to schools, any, health centers. I mean, large infrastructure projects are expensive, and it is. I, talked with a member of Congress who said that tax exempt municipal bonds are part of the fabric of our infrastructure, and without them, so much good could not continue because it would be just entirely too expensive. But then, if you move forward and say we have to do this, then that additional cost is borne by your residents.
Right. And that's really the where it ultimately ends, right? The increased cost is going to end up on the taxpayer, not
That's right.
necessarily the government. Obviously, the government
Right.
is going to have to tax for that. So that was a huge win. I got to say, when we were visiting the New York delegation back in May, we had great conversations with all the New York congressional members. We visited almost every one of them,
Mm-hmm.
and they all got that. They were all very strong on that. So no more good work by NATaT there, making sure we got out and spread our message to, as you said, with the 9 different members, everybody took their delegation on, and that was really gave us an ability to talk to a lot of different congressional members. So,
That's right. And I'll say this too. I mean, NATaT, we partner with a lot of other
mhm.
organizations to focus on specific issues.
Yep.
So one of the groups that we're a part of is called the Public Finance Network, which is run through the Government Finance Officers Association. And what the Public Finance Network did is they partnered with a program at the University of Chicago, which ran data reports that listed every single um, tax exempt municipal bond that has been utilized in each congressional district in the country,
Wow.
every single congressional district. So they ran that data, and then they have it also statewide for the senators. So what we were able to do during our fly-in is walk into, the, your member of Congress in the second district and say, here are all the program or all the projects that have historically been funded by tax exempt municipal bonds in your district. And based on this number, this is how much money these this these tax exempt municipal bonds have saved taxpayers in your district. So they were armed with such great data. That's one of the things too, that with effective lobbying, just to kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent here, um, providing that backup, that data, and the stories as to why a particular issue is important or should be important to a member of Congress is so crucial,
Yeah.
right? So for them to have that data, for somebody from anywhere town, New York, to be able to go in and say to their member of Congress, this project was would not have happened but for the use of tax exempt municipal bonds. And I think, I mean, that's just it's a really strong and effective way of getting to where we needed to get. And that was, they did not identify tax exempt municipal bonds as a way to pay for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which that would have been, it's a huge revenue raiser because that's a lot of money. But it was never in any sort of list or bill um, uh, that we found. I mean, there were discussions, obviously, but I think we got in front of, along with everyone in the Public Finance Network, and frankly, everyone in the local government advocacy space, got in front of their members and said, don't touch these tax
Yeah.
exempt muni bonds. And we were very successful.
Yeah, it was a very effective campaign we all put together, and with your leadership and getting that done. The other very important thing to New Yorkers anyway, I know not every
Mhm.
state is thrilled with this, but New York seems to be, if not probably the highest property tax state in the
Sure.
nation. And I always have to say, people always put that on the local governments, but it is not because of the local governments. It's because of the mandates that come down from the state of New York and how the state of New York finances. And frankly, we might be able to touch into this if we have enough time later, but direct funding from local governments often
Mhm.
goes to the states. But the SALT deductions go into 40,000 from, I think it was 10,000 before the
Yeah.
2017 bill. I think it was up there around 40,000. This was critically important to our towns and our municipalities because it's important to the taxpayers within those communities. But a lot of people don't realize it's a phase. There's a little bit of a phase in, right? The 40,000 and then a little boost over 5 years. Can you talk about the phase out of that?
Sure. Yeah, and so just to back up just a little bit. So before the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there was no cap on state and local tax. And the Tax Cut and Jobs Act capped your SALT deductions, so you can deduct your whatever you pay to your state or local government um, from your federal income taxes, so you're not basically taxed twice. for property and income tax. So the uh that was a big issue with, like you said, the high property states to go from no cap to 10,000 cap. And then also they, made changes with individual tax brackets to, here's if one standard deduction versus itemized deductions. And so it really kind of was a 1-2 punch in 2017 for high property tax states like New York. So what happened and what we experienced in DC is um the House bill for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act included a $40,000 cap on salt. The Senate bill was 10,000. And there was a lot of negotiating behind the scenes. And frankly, the salt issue is really what held up the bill for a long time because, I will say, you New Yorkers put a line in the sand, and we weren't going to walk away until we got what we wanted. And it was great and it worked. And so, but there are some concessions. But there's some good stuff too. So basically, it increases your $10,000 salt cap to 40,000, and that's for individuals who itemize. Okay, and it also is that amount is going to increase a small percentage each year. So basically, it's adjusting that cap to inflation. Starts in tax year 2025 and goes through tax year 2030. And then after tax year 2030, the cap goes back down to 10,000. But one of the things that they are doing is also it's a phase down for taxpayers who make over $500,000 a year. So basically, you phase down the $40,000 salt cap at a 30% rate for taxpayers that are making over 50,000. So it's essentially it's reduced, but it doesn't have to go below 10,000. Right. So really 10,000 is the floor, 40 is the ceiling, except each subsequent year that's going to basically sort of adjust for inflation. But for individuals making 500,000 or more, there is, kind of a 30% cut off rate, which essentially gets you back down to 10,000.
Yep. For now, at least through 2030, it's going to help a majority of New Yorkers, which is great. We'll see what happens in 2030 and 2031 and who has control of what and what happens after that. But that was a big win, I think, for New York municipalities in particular. And you're right. I remember talking to the congressional. There was actually one Congress member that came out and talked to us about it, and they definitely said the line is drawn on this. And so that was great. I wanted to get to just a little bit, not into the weeds with this one because there's a lot to it, but very important here in New York. And I think nationally is affordable housing. And I think one of the major things in this bill that helps local governments address the affordable housing issue within their communities is the making the 12% tax increase for local low-income housing tax credit. Can you just talk a little bit about that and if that has a phase in or phase out?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no phase in or phase out. It is a permanent increase to access to basically a more competitive type of tax credit. So there are two types of tax credits through the low income housing tax credit program, a 9% and a 4%. We call it NATaT. And there are a limited number of 9% LIHTCs that are available to each state every year. This bill doubles the amount of LIHTCs that are 9% LIHTCs that are available to each state per year, and then they have like basically dollar amount limitations that's been increased. So this tax credit is utilized by builders, developers, right? But it is a way for local governments to work with developers to create almost an incentive package to build affordable housing in their communities.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of nuance in there, but the good news is there is a greater number of the more competitive LIHTCs available each year than there were prior to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Which is
I will
great,
say
great news.
it's great news. I mean, it's a great tool. And it's, one of many tools that states and local governments can utilize to get more affordable housing built in their communities. Just as an aside, and this is kind of hot off the presses, the Senate Banking Committee, the chair and ranking members, so Tim Scott from South Carolina and Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, have just unveiled a massive housing bill, bipartisan housing bill. That there was a hearing today, and they're going to advance this bill, but we're going to see more good changes, hopefully, to LIHTC, as well as other programs that will help address our nation's housing shortage and access issues to housing. So just as a heads up there, that's it's the largest housing legislative package we've seen in my memory of being here in Washington.
So you're saying that the NATaT Talk of the Towns podcast is breaking news here.
Breaking
You
news.
come here, you get breaking news. I love
That's
it.
exactly right. We're
You
going
broke
to,
it on this
we're going to be on the
podcast.
national news programs tonight, Chris.
I love it. Overall, I know the big beautiful bill is controversial. I know everybody has different opinions of it. Everyone has different. The analysis of how it's going to impact everybody's different. But I would say overall, from my perspective as an executive director of a statewide association, maybe of yours, where you are on a more national level, I think generally speaking, we did well for local governments. I think really was a positive for local governments. We don't get that a lot. We don't get a lot of those wins often. So I have to say kudos to you and your team and your partners, all the members of NATaT, but I think we did well.
I agree. I mean, we had 4 priorities, and each of those priorities were addressed in a positive way. So I consider that a big win for NATaT, big win for NIOT, and all of our state organizations. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll leave the big beautiful bill there. Before we end the podcast, I do want to talk to you just quickly about transportation priorities. I know you have a lot. We have a lot on our agenda. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So every 5 to 6 years, Congress passes a surface transportation authorization bill, and our and NATaT, we have worked over the last several authorization bills to make some really good changes to programs that benefit our local governments. And so it's a big opportunity for us to address some of the issues that we have heard about, the lack of funding coming down to the local level for the lack of federal funding that's directed to the local level. So we towns, our NATaT towns and townships manage more miles of road than any other government entity within our states, whether it's the state DOTs, the counties. That we manage more miles of road, but don't get any direct funding from the federal government to help offset those costs.
Yep.
And so that's a message that we have been sort of pounding in Washington to say we've got to do better in getting the money down to literally where the rubber meets the road.
Yep.
And so, and then, we've got various definitions of, there are a number of competitive grant programs, right, that your towns can apply for, and I'm sure have been very successful. But I just, you're gonna hear my dogs. I'm gonna put on mute for 1 second. I'm so
No problem. This is the life of podcasting, live podcasting right here. Well, Jennifer's taking care of her dogs. I'll just say that, there's really, really few things that are more important than transportation funding. Here in New York, we get something called CHIPS. We get a variety of other small programs that all come together.
Yeah.
We advocate very hard on trying to make sure we get more of that because, as you said, local roads are so critically important to building communities. I tell our folks here in the legislature, local roads are about economic development. They're about public safety. They're about so many more things, about building a community. And you hit on it. You said something, Jennifer, that there are more local miles of local roads than state or federal roads. And I was in a budget hearing this past February here in New York State, and I said that to the panel, and one senator challenged me with, well, maybe so, but we have so much more volume on ours than, you may have on a local. And I said, but look at it this way. I may travel the New York State Thruway once every couple of months, maybe, but every single day I'm on a local road. It
Right.
takes me to work. It takes me shopping. It takes me to go out wherever I have to go. I have to touch a local road. It touches people every single day.
That's absolutely right. And you think about farm to market, right? Your
Yeah.
food.
Yep.
You ultimately you have to be on these local roads in order to literally get farm to market. That's one of our priorities in the transportation authorization bill is there are efforts to try to get heavier, larger trucks allowed on our interstate highways. Well, that's great, but they have to start and end somewhere. And so
Right.
those heavier, larger trucks have to get to the farm or wherever, or pick up whatever it is that they're hauling and drop off whatever that it is they're hauling. And they're not doing that on the interstate. They're doing it on our local roads. And so the point is you can't make these changes to size and weight limits for the federal aid highway system without taking into account what impact that's going to have on local roads.
Right.
So that's one of our big priorities also. But as I was saying before my doorbell rang, there are some grant programs, right, that are available that that provides your direct funding to your local local priorities. But there's for example, a grant program within the Department of Transportation called the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program. And that is ultimately to get more money down to rural roads. But it defines rural as 250,000 or below.
Oh.
And and that's not a real world definition of rural.
No.
So we have worked to get legislation introduced to change that population number to much less than 250,000. We started off at 20,000. I believe it's at 30 now, but that bill will ultimately be folded into a larger transportation authorization bill so that you have a rural surface transportation grant program that actually goes to rural communities where any common sense or sensical definition of rural is certainly not 250,000 or
Well,
below.
I mean, certainly when you look at just the municipality itself, there are, they like to take the greater area and talk about 250,000, maybe in the greater Buffalo area, the greater Rochester
Sure,
area. But any of our
sure.
upstate cities outside of New York City, none of them are that high in population. So theoretically, the cities of the state of New York would have access to the rural dollars, which is
Absolutely.
fundamentally unfair.
Absolutely. So
Yes.
it's completely unfair. So that's one
Yes.
of the things that we're working on. Another thing that we have done in previous authorization bills is make sure that there's a program called the Off System Bridge Program, and that every year each state DOT gets a formula bridge allocation, and this off-system bridge program allows or requires a certain percentage of those funds to be used on non-federal bridges. So that would
Mhm.
include state and local bridges.
Yep.
Um, Depending on your state DOT, those funds may go to mainly state bridges and really not make it down to the local level. But what we've done historically is we've gotten the set aside increased from 15% to 20. And we're working in the next authorization to not just add additional money to your annual bridge allocation period. So that set aside is therefore larger, but also to ensure even smaller bridges and local bridges actually do get access to those funds. So that's something that we're working on right now.
So I want to touch on that, but we can't today because we are
Sure.
running out of time. But I think,
Sure.
Jennifer, we could go on and on and on many issues. I think, having another podcast where you can come back and we can talk about, you know, direct federal funding to local governments, what happens in New York State when it goes to the state. You touched on it a little bit where DOT sucks up everything and nothing actually gets to the local government. But there's a counterpoint to that, and local governments need to get a little bit better at addressing some issues, and we uncovered that in ARPA. So, those are things I think we can come back and talk about maybe again if you're willing to do that.
Sure.
Um,
I'd be happy to.
and grants, grants are a wonderful thing. We're working very hard in New York State on something called SWAP. You and I have talked about this when we came down to visit, where we're looking to have the state invest in a formula based, like a CHIPS program, like an AIM
Mhm.
program, into the municipalities. The thing about grants is there's a few things. First of all, it's competitive. It puts neighbor against neighbor. It's a Hunger Games situation. It's a great way for a lot of money to go to a few municipalities, but we think every municipality should get something to invest in infrastructure. In this case, clean water. In your case, you're talking about roads. And so we're working very hard on that because grants are expensive to
Mhm.
source, they're expensive to write, they're expensive to apply to, they're time consuming, they're expensive to administer. You often need to hire consultants, put match money in. And so we're trying to work more towards direct funding. That's a huge focus for NIAT. And so that's something I think maybe we can come back and do a second podcast. If you felt this was painless enough and you want to come back again, it would be great.
It was painless for sure. I'd be happy to.
That's
Well,
great.
if the viewers want me back.
They do. I'm sure of it. I am absolutely sure of it. I do want to say thank you. I want to point out to our viewers, all our NIAT members out there, how hard NIAT and NATaT is working on your behalf. I think you heard a lot of that today from Jennifer. They do an incredible job. They keep us informed. They send us bulletins and information, and all these things we're able to share with you, the members. That all comes from NATaT, so that's very important. And they helped us critically in the ARPA situation where some members needed to spend money or send their reports in. And we worked very hard with our members that were a little bit lacking there to get that done by the federal timeline. So great work. We're working hard. I think Jennifer and New York, we work really well together.
Mm,
Sarah's phenomenal. We love engaging every opportunity we get. So thank you for all your work.
thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Stay cool.
Thank you. Before we leave, I do want to remind our viewers that you can, as we said earlier, find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple platform. We always ask for a like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. We've moved to a 2-week schedule, so every 2 weeks. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another exciting podcast of Talk of the Towns. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Enjoy.
Thanks, Chris. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.